Safi, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tim. Glad to be here.
And I'm going to read your bio here. This is one of the several, I would say, interviews that I've done where it's not going to be a challenge, as I said to one of my employees earlier, to find things to talk about. It's going to be a matter of trying to ask you all the things I would like to ask you, but I'll give people some context first. So, by way of bio, Safi Bahcall. You can find him on Twitter at Safi Bahcall. That's Safibahcall. Received his PhD in physics from Stanford and his undergrad degree from Harvard. After working as a consultant for McKinsey, Safi co-founded a biotechnology company specializing in developing new drugs for cancer. He led its IPO and served as its CEO for 13 years. In 2008, Safi was named Ernst & Young's New England Biotechnology Entrepreneur of the Year. In 2011, he worked with President Obama's Council of Science Advisors on the future of national research. Safi, you are most recently author of Loonshots. That is the subtitle, How to Nurture the Crazy Ideas That Win Wars, Cure Diseases, and Transform Industries, which has some of the best cover blurbs I've ever seen on any book. We might talk about that. Daniel Kahneman does not give a lot of blurbs for books. Loonshots describes what an idea from physics tells us about the behavior of groups and how teams, companies, and nations can use that to innovate faster and better. It has been selected for Washington Post's 10 leadership books to watch for 2019, Inc.'s 10 business books you need to read in 2019, and Business Insider's 14 books everyone will be reading in 2019. That would be good for you if that ends up being the case. And we go back a ways. So I've been really excited to catch up because our lives have changed quite a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Since we last were spending a lot of time together. And I thought we could just start at the very beginning. So could you describe for people how we first met and a little bit of the context?
All right, sure. So we were at, this was maybe 10 years or so ago, and we were at the Sundance where is Sundance?
Sundance is in Utah.
It's Sundance in Utah, and there's a conference organized every year by Peter Thiel and Oren Hoffman, and Oren's a good friend of mine for many years. And I was sitting at a lunch table, and I had just taken up as sort of a hobby triathlon, long-distance triathlon, and I had just learned for the first time kind of real swimming, not just sort of splashing around in a pool, but how can you, because splashing around in a pool, you can swim a couple laps and you get tired, but that's not going to help you if you want to swim 1.2 miles in the ocean. So I had found this course called Total Immersion, and I was just having such a blast, because it takes you from, a 2 out of 10 to like a 5 to 7 to 8 really, really quickly. So you can knock out 1.2 miles, no problem. So I was sitting at lunch, and somehow there was this guy, kind of quiet but happy guy next to me, and he had also just taken up Total Immersion Swimming. And then we just totally connected on how amazing it was and how it can transform your swimming and how it's a metaphor for life. And I started using that as a metaphor for learning and breaking down everything you know about life, about a swim stroke and all the bad habits that you learn, and replacing them, and how interesting it is that just small little tweaks can take you so rapidly from a 2 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10 or a 7 or an 8. And what kind of a joy that is, and how that can apply in so many areas of life. And this other guy sitting next to me was like, yes, absolutely. And I just did Total Immersion too. And I feel exactly the same way. And then since then, we've been friends.
And Total Immersion, in a way, is such a perfect introduction and metaphor for a lot of what you do in life and what impresses me about you. And as you mentioned, a great example of learning something in a atypical way, right? Because it's not just looking at the small things that have a disproportionate output or testing them, but also it is fundamentally about testing assumptions, right? And for those people who don't know, we won't spend the entire interview on Total Immersion, but it's a great lead-in, because speaking as someone who's born and raised on Long Island, surrounded by water, had a few near-drowning experiences when I was very young, I did not learn how to swim, meaning I could not do to and fro in a decent-sized pool until my 30s. and had a really acute fear of water. And after about a week of total immersion by myself with a book, keep in mind, not even video at that point, was doing 20, 30 laps at a time and finding it relaxing, which is just bonkers to think about. And I'd failed up to that point, even though another friend, Chris Sacca, had... Actually, no, it wasn't Chris Sacca at that point. Before that, another friend, Chris Ashenden, had assigned me a New Year's resolution. We realized we're more likely to actually fulfill our New Year's resolutions if we assign each other resolutions with sort of rewards and punishments. And mine was to do a 1 kilometer open water swim. And his was to drink nothing stronger than green tea for a year because he liked double espressos. But I had failed up to that point in part because every lesson started the same way, which was here's a kickboard. Right. And go do 10 laps in the pool. And after a lap and a half, I'm like, I can't even feel my legs. I'm so tired.
Right.
And the lesson was as good as done. And then you take total immersion. And one of the first things Terry Laughlin encourages you to think about is minimizing the legs and minimizing drag. Right. And it's just a rethinking of the entire approach to swimming. So you, more than almost anyone I've met.
I feel like 10 years ago, we're like having the same conversation again 10 years ago. And the really cool thing about it, the way it applies to so many areas of life that I found is it starts by a counterintuitive take on something that everybody does or believes is true. And that is, well, if you're swimming forward, you want to see where you're going, so you raise your head. And so that's exactly what's wrong with swimming, with most like casual swimming, because then you're like kicking your feet to maintain horizontal balance. And by kicking your feet, you're using, 80 or 90% of your energy is just going to correct bad position. That's why you're tired. And so in so many areas of life, when you learn this kind of bad habit that's this very natural that every human does, once you become self-aware of that, it's really not hard to just put your head down.
Yeah.
And don't kick. That's it. That's basically the magic.
Yeah.
Put your head down and don't kick. And that's it. And then so many different areas of life, it turns out there are these bad habits, these things that you think you should be doing, or you're programmed to do, or everybody tells you to do, and they create drag in going through life. And then someday somebody, maybe it's Tim Ferriss, says, here's this really counterintuitive, weird trick. Don't do that. Do this. And all of a sudden the drag goes away and you can swim a mile. And, I actually think it reminds me, you mentioned, we were talking a little bit about Daniel Kahneman and how he transformed economics. It's very similar, right? Because what he said, for economists for 200 years had said, oh, there's one way to think about, incentives and how they influence behavior. Everybody calculates, net present expected value of my financial return doing X and doing Y, and if X is greater than Y, I do X.
The rational actors.
Just right. And Kahneman just said, I'm a psychologist, and that's like bullshit. That's just not what happens. That's not what people do. People operate on these little rules of thumb, and sometimes X may rationally be greater than Y, but they do Y anyway for these reasons. And it's not rocket. It was a very simple adjustment, like hold your head flat and don't kick.
Yeah.
It was basically saying, hey, humans are humans. They're not calculators. That's it.
Yeah.
And that transformed economics. So there you see just like the same total immersion swimming trick, which changes swimming, is what Kahneman did for economics. It changed economics with this one idea. Actually, humans are humans. They operate on some heuristics, not NPV calculations. And economists were like, that's not possible. They operate on NPV. Like, I don't think so. I kind of know humans, and they don't do that. Yeah. Which is, in retrospect, sounds sort of obvious, but it was a big, big change.
Yeah, it's, you know more. Well, you've forgotten more probably in the last week than I'll ever know about physics. But it as a layman who's interested in science, but by no means a real scientist, it makes me think of Richard Feynman, and I'm going to butcher this, I'm sure, but something along the lines of, it doesn't matter how pretty your theory is, if it doesn't fit with experiment, it's wrong.
That's right.
And there's a lot of disregarding perhaps the obvious in favor of these legacy theories that just do not fit sort of the reality that is right in front of you. Funny, well, maybe not funny, but little known fact, I was actually a subject in some of Kahneman's studies when I was an undergrad for my $4 an hour or whatever, hitting a space bar with various psychological studies in Green Hall.
That's right. He was at Princeton, and you were at Princeton, and actually that's sort of the connection. Like I think he was a neighbor of my mom and dad, because I grew up in Princeton.
Oh, that's right. I didn't. Well, we'll talk about growing up in towns like Princeton another time. I didn't grow up in Princeton, but I grew up in the end of Long Island, which has some similar dynamics. Let's zoom out a bit, and we're going to do this quite a bit in this conversation, I think, because I want to talk about, Safi, the individual and your personal practices and your thinking, because I think there's a lot. I don't think there is a lot to explore there. You are one of the most systematic people I know, but I also want to give people the context on your career and some of what you've done and your past, because I think it's helpful. And we were just talking about Terry Laughlin, who passed away not all too long ago, and he was hospitalized shortly after, just before and then shortly after my interview with him, which was the last long-form interview he ever did. And he had cancer and then a stroke that was a complication and a number of things following, and then he passed away, which was very sad. What is your history with cancer, in the sense that why did you get involved with anything related to cancer?
Well, I started in academic science and theoretical physics, and after a few years, and this may be a personality flaw, but and it's taken me many years to appreciate this, but I really get excited. All right, I'll explain this in physics geek language, and then I'll try to try. There's a saying, the way I think about it is I couple to the derivative, and I'll break that down. So the derivative is a slope. So, zero derivative means no slope, and big derivative means a very high slope. And in physics, when you say you couple to something, an electron is traveling along and it has some coupling constant to the photon, and that's how it interacts with light, and that's always the case. And so when I say I couple to derivative, it means that I derive energy from the slope of learning. And so when I started in theoretical physics, I was learning an enormous amount. And then after I was in one area of theoretical physics called particle physics. It's the science of the very small, what happens inside a proton or a neutron, the quarks. And after a few years, I sort of felt like I had, gotten very deep in that tunnel, and I wasn't learning as much. And there were, I'm not going to exaggerate, there was a ton still out there to learn, but it wasn't like drinking from a fire hose, like starting off feeling like an imposter, or starting off being barely able to swim one lap and then going to swimming a kilometer, no problem. And, particle physics has gotten a little stuck in the last 20 or 30 years in some sense, which we can talk about some other time. So I switched to a totally different area after about 5 years. And then I got into the business world. I realize I'm kind of far from your cancer question.
That's okay.
But it's, I switched out of academic science because after about 5 years, in each of these areas, I felt like I'd sort of learned and I wanted to learn something new. So I went into the business world, went into McKinsey, didn't know anything about, I didn't even own a suit. Actually, I remember, all right, can I take a digression for a weird little story?
I love digressions for weird stories.
Right,
so yes, I'll remember, if need be, and I don't think that
I'm getting kind of far from your cancer question, I realize now, but like sort of a funny story. So it's kind of how I ended up in cancer when I started off in this weird physics place. So I basically hadn't set foot off a university until I was 30, because my parents are academic scientists. We just mentioned Princeton, and so I spent a lot of time around there, and then college, grad school, postdoc. And then I was sort of getting a little like, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? Just, write papers and grants and referee and this thing, conferences. So I started exploring, as some friend had been to this company called McKinsey, which I'd never heard of. And they said, look, they're sort of interesting problem solving. It's sort of like, I'm like, all right, I'll do that. Signed, sent an application, interview comes, and my friend told me, you need to wear a suit. And I'm like, wow, I haven't had a suit since my bar mitzvah, like 18 years ago or whatever. So I asked, like, where do you buy a suit? And so I got the name of a place, and I went in. It was this like incredible place with these super expensive clothes, and like it was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. It was called the Men's Warehouse. And so I bought a suit, and I felt like I paid like $120 or something. And I was like, this is like 10x more than I've ever paid for any clothing item. And I felt like $1 million. And I fly to New York for this interview with this firm. And I remember coming into the city and like getting off and walking up Park Avenue. And I'm wearing like this old beat up ski jacket because, I would go skiing, and I didn't realize that people also have some fancy jacket. It's like everybody around me is wearing this like, blue. Now I know it's
like the overcoat.
Exactly. So I got this like, I feel like $1 million because I have this $120 Men's Warehouse suit, and like, I probably spent $18 on the Men's Warehouse tie, and I'm feeling really extravagant. And then I'm like walking down the street, and I have this beat up old ski jacket with like still the ski tags hanging off of it
on top of your Men's Warehouse suit.
My Men's Warehouse suit. And I'm like, why am I the only one wearing this on this whole street? I'm like, that's weird. And so then I get to my interview, and I hide the jacket in the coat closet before I get in there. But anyway, I did that, and that was drinking from a fire hose because I'd never set foot off a university, and all of a sudden I'm wearing a suit, and I hadn't worn a suit since my bar mitzvah. And then they throw you, they take time to sort of educate you a little bit online, and that was super fun. All these, professors fly in to just educate you, and I'm like, this is the best thing ever. They're paying me, and all these professors are flying into this 4-week course on this resort with 30 people from all over the world who are really interesting people my age, and people are flying in just to teach us all day long. I'm like, this is awesome. And I'm learning all this new stuff. And I was drinking from a fire hose, and it was sort of going from, in this case, it was a 0 out of 10. I never even balanced a checkbook. If I had $6 to buy a burrito in San Francisco, I was happy. That's awesome. And, but after a couple years, you're like, oh, okay, now I got what people do for a living and how it works and the business stuff. And then I was like, how do I combine, I don't think I just want to be a guy who sort of whispers to people, here's what you might want to do if you want to build your business. I wanted to sort of do something, but I wanted to do something back in the science world, and also something that was more about either, let's make more money, which is, what big companies are trying to do, and what as a consultant, you're trying to help them. And in academia, it's about the search for truth. So I wanted to do something different that would feel like, it may be a little corny or cliche, but you're helping people who are suffering. And there's something, you could be very selfish about it, there's something just very satisfying. Even if you just think at the local level, there's a kid in a hospital bed and family's going to lose that kid, and if something you can do could help save that kid, and so that family and that kid have decades of life together, even if that's just one kid, that feels so much more satisfying than having X or Y or Z in the bank, or even publishing another original research paper, so that's on your... If you can see a family experiencing life together for decades and they might not have, that's incredibly satisfying. And so I sort of stumbled into cancer, to get back to your question, because that was a really hot research area. This was 18, 19 years ago. That was a really exciting area, and there was really very little progress made in that area. And I had spent about 6 months or a year kind of talking to scientists at different universities who might have some promising ideas and didn't want to work with venture capitalists, and thought that physics was sort of like this exotic, weird bird. And so I was sort of, they were just like, who is this guy who's coming to talk to us about biology and chemistry and medicine and oncology, and he's a physicist. So it was a mutual interest there. And eventually started a company and just got more and more into it and interested in seeing these individual lives and how little progress had been made and how many good ideas were floating around. And if I could make a difference bridging some of those ideas into the real world, into the commercial world, into the business world, into the industry where they could become drugs that could save lives. Even if you just save one kid, help one family, that would feel incredibly satisfying, more satisfying than writing a paper or making money. So that's kind of how I got into cancer and oncology.
And I wanted to thank you for that. I had never heard the Men's Warehouse story either. This is I think something I wanted to establish early on because it gives an indication of where you were pointed, right? And then when we get into the habits and the routines and the frameworks and so on that you use personally or within organizations, it shows some of the how, but I wanted to at least get to some of the why first. Let's take a bit of a 90-degree turn, and this is going to seem strange, but I thought this would be a good illustration of not just Safi, the sort of scientific innovator, but you the person, because they go together. So I'm gonna read what I think is a quote. This is in doing research for having this conversation, which is always a little strange when I'm doing research on my close friends. I don't know, it feels like I'm doing something illicit. In any case, I'm going to read something, and then you can give us context for what this is and why you have this habit or had it. I would get so excited when I stumbled across a perfect passage in its beautiful music. I would preserve it in an Evernote file, whip out my phone at dinner, and read that passage to whoever my poor dinner companion happened to be, pounding the table to the rhythm, pointing out the beauty in the choices. See how he did X here and not Y. That's why it works. Silence. No one cared, but I enjoyed it. So what is this about?
Oh, man. I don't know how you find this stuff, but so that had to do with another detail. So I was with this company that I started for 13 or so years, and then through a weird series of coincidences and stumbles and different things, ended up writing. And so first I wrote a kind of a long form essay, and then, it was sort of 15,000 words. I edited a lot, and people seemed to like it. And then some much more experienced author friends and journalist friends were like, nobody publishes 15,000 word essays anymore. That's a book. Also, you have a lot of ideas in here, and that needs to be fleshed out. It's too. So that turned into a book. And as I started with writing, I kind of broke it down a little like swimming. Like, what are you think you know. People tell you a bunch of stuff. And the more you get into it, the more you realize a lot of stuff that people tell you is really not very helpful or often wrong. And
could you give any examples?
Oh, just like don't use passive voice. There are actually some great reasons you do want to use passive voice, but if I get this picture of like this old school mom like hitting you with a ruler from the 19th. Don't use passive voice. Never use passive voice. Always use active voice. And then you read some of these like phenomenally beautiful passages, and you look in them, and they're using passive voice left and right. And like, really? Because these guys are like some of these guys have won the Nobel Prize, for example, or Pulitzer Prize, and they're using. So why? And
just for people who are, could you give an example of active and passive voice for people who may not be familiar with the terms?
The active voice is Johnny flew the helicopter to go put out videotape the fire, and then it's so funny. I don't like do these things. A helicopter was brought in to go, view the fire from high above and film it for video. And so when the helicopter was brought in, it's kind of passive. Mm-hmm. Johnny flew the helicopter. Yep. Now, in this case, for example, why would you want to use the passive voice? Well, if you're telling a story, you're telling the story of the fire. Do you really need to know that Johnny flew that helicopter to put out that fire? I think this is an example and something I've seen like that specific helicopter. Do you really? It's actually kind of distracting because Johnny is kind of irrelevant to the story. So what you're doing is you're inserting something in the reader's mind that's an irrelevant distraction that you'll never come back to. And that just is a glitch in the storytelling.
Right.
So that's one example of why you want to use. There are many examples of why you want to use. But anyways, as part of, I found that people had sort of said, "Oh, you're a pretty good writer." I think that's meaning for like a physicist. So that's a really low bar. And or even a CEO or a public company, you're like, that's a really low bar. You're pretty good for a public company executive. I'm like, thanks. That's like I'm a 1.5 out of a, rather than a 1. But I just started to find it fun to try to break down writing, like you break down swimming or break down other things, and then how do you train to get better? And so I read a lot, and eventually I came up with a kind of a training. And I would write, I'd drop my daughter off at school in the morning and come back, kind of lock myself in this little 8x8 cave, shut down everything, and just do one of the 3 sort of modes of writing, whether you're reading, you're writing, or editing. And 5, 6 o'clock, pick my daughter up from school, from daycare, bring her back, dinner, and then my wife would check out at like 7:38. She gets up really early, and she was just done. So from 8 o'clock on, every day for almost 2 years, I would bring out one of, actually just a couple books. And often I would just go, we were living on Mass Ave in Cambridge, and so there are a lot of great bars, a little restaurant. And I would go to the bar counter, get a burger or pizza or something and a beer, and I would spend the next 2 hours usually just on 2 paragraphs.
Were these the same books or different books each time? Or they were consistently the same?
Almost always the same. Actually, I would focus on probably 2 books, and I would just dissect a paragraph or 2 from those 2 books for almost a year. And that was one of the other things, like with swimming, everybody says keep your head up, or it's natural to keep your head up. There's this natural inclination to try to read a ton, read widely, read all these authors, and you get all these lists of, here's my favorite 20 authors. I'm like, oh, I should read those 20. There's somebody else's favorite 20. Oh, I should read those 20. And so I kind of threw all that out and said, I'm going to actually focus on, I don't know much about literature. I never, I did sports, and I did like math and science, and that's it. I really didn't read it. So I have like a big gap but I picked 2 books that really resonated for me.
What did you pick?
Nabokov, short stories, and I'll explain why, and Donald Hall, Essays After 80. And this is for just to develop an ear for writing. And I just read a paragraph or 2 or 3 from those books each night, and then I would break it down. Like, why did this guy use... I wasn't reading for content. I was just reading for ear. So Nabokov, I had read a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and reading here. And then I picked... Some friend, I think, had pointed me to Nabokov short stories. And by the way, I should say, I don't think I've read anything else of his. Just that one. And when I opened it up at random, Nabokov's short stories, and I started reading his sentences, like my jaw dropped. I didn't know the English language could do that. How is this guy doing that? It's probably sort of like your sports thing, like with athletes, like how the freaking hell is this guy doing it? And it's just so different at such a higher level than anyone. So that's why I would take 2 paragraphs at a time or 3 paragraphs, and I'd say, why did he put this word here in this sentence and not there? Because the natural thing would be, let's say, to make it active voice. Or the natural thing would be, why did he use this transition from this sentence, the end of this one, to the beginning, or the end of this paragraph? Suppose I do it differently. It just sounds worse. Why? Why does it sound worse when I move this word? And he could have picked any word. There are like 6 words you could imagine that mean this thing. why did he pick this one? Let me try a different one. And then, oh, it just sounds worse. And I would just do that repeatedly. And Nabokov I picked because his sentences and rhythm and musicality of his writing was just like jaw-dropping, and everyone is a 10 out of 10. It's not like, oh, there's a great sentence or a great passage.
Not a one-hit wonder.
It's it's just like, how the freaking hell does this guy do this? And again, I have to say, I'm not a literature guy or an English guy, and there's 99% of like famous authors I've not read. I just couldn't believe this. And so I was, how does this guy do this? But it was, and once after doing this sort of over and over, and then there were a few other beautiful passages and I would capture them in my Evernote, and then I would highlight the word, like why this word in yellow, and then sometimes I would bold, like he did uses a lot of alliterations, and I would highlight the first letters just to see his alliterations, and then I would highlight the transitions, and then I would break down the transitions between paragraphs into like, well, there's 7 different types of transitions. Here's an example of one. Here's, oh, this is the pivot transition, and so I started to get a sense of that, and I started having this weird experience after doing this for a year or so, which was I would read passages and I would hear music, and I would hear them. I would hear them in my head, but as music and as harmony. So when I was read, for example, Nabokov, I would hear. This is a little weird to say all this stuff because it's like private internal mind thing that I'm doing. I don't really talk about it out loud.
This is the podcast for that.
Oh yeah, nobody listens to it, right?
No, it's just you, me, and a handful of our best friends.
It's just you and me, right? So it's all private stuff. I would just hear this thing like music, and it was in perfect harmony. And then I'd pick up the newspaper, or I'd pick up some other stuff or some random book, and I couldn't read more than 2 sentences because it just sounded like clashing. Well, the transition and the use of passive, and it didn't. This word could have been that word. And I'm like, I can't even read more than 3 sentences because it's grating. And then I go back to, this other thing where there was perfect harmony, and it was just musical. It was just, I wouldn't even at some point I wouldn't even know why. But one thing would just grate, and I get like these. It's like somebody rubbing fingers on chalkboard, or like, and the other one it's just like.
So can we talk about decisions a bit more?
Sure.
Okay. Because you are examining, in that case, decisions of a writer. So you're doing a sort of forensic analysis of why certain things happen, why certain choices were made. And this may be a natural place, maybe not. You can tell me. To talk a little bit about a totally different field, although similar sounding last name, Garry Kasparov.
Oh, Garry Kasparov.
Yeah. So, could you describe to me why you find Kasparov interesting? And who he is for people who don't know.
Yeah. Okay, another book that I really enjoyed was his book Life Imitates Chess. I love that book, and I love it for a lot of reasons. I have a real admiration of like excellent chess players because it's something that takes incredible focus, incredible commitment, and people who do it really well do something I could never do, and it's so impressive. So I've always found it fascinating to follow, learn about great chess players, and I listened to some podcasts you did with a guy named Josh Waitzkin, which was fascinating. I actually loved his book too. And then because of that, I went and I didn't know who he was before, got his book, which was awesome about
the art of learning,
love of learning,
the art of learning,
the art of learning, right?
Yeah, you guys would love each other. At some point, you should meet.
Yeah, and I because he did chess and then did martial arts, and I did martial arts for a long time, and then physics. So Kasparov, as you mean, is the longest reigning chess champion in history. And he wrote this book about how life imitates chess, where he kind of breaks down what he did. And it's so fascinating. But one particular lesson really resonated for me as a mindset shift for how to think about making decisions or analyzing decisions, both in business life and in personal life. So Kasparov said kind of one of, if not the key to his success in chess was after a game, whether he won or lost, rather than analyze the game by saying, oh, I moved pawn to bishop, pawn takes bishop here, and that was a bad move, and that lost the game, so next time I shouldn't do pawn takes bishop. Rather than analyze the move and the outcome, which is what most chess players do, and you can call that kind of an outcome mindset, he analyzed, how did I arrive at the decision to make that move? Not just so much the move itself, but what was my decision-making process? Which series of moves did I go through? How long did I go through them? What did I consider? In what order? How did I prepare for the match? And how did that affect all these sort of meta level, not the outcome itself, but one step above, which is, what was my process that I used to arrive at that decision? And given that it was a bad decision, where did that process break down in my decision? And therefore, how should I tweak my decision-making process? And he said that one ingredient, that one lesson, keep asking why did you make that decision? You can call that sort of a system mindset. Let's analyze the system rather than the outcome. That's one higher level, and then has enormous power and leverage. Because once you tweak your process, if you can identify a weakness in your process and adjust that process, now, not only next time won't you do pawn takes bishop, which is a bet, you might do pawn does something else, but you've now improved your process, which can help you in 500 other situations. Rather than help you in one situation, that can help you in 500. And so I took that, and I call that sort of system versus outcome mindset, and that can help you enormously in personal life or in business life. And so that's the Kasparov story.
And this has extremely, as you're saying, wide-ranging implications and applications, right? So this outcome versus process distinction is also something that comes up if you talk to any really, really high-level poker player, right? Because you can have a great outcome that is just dumb luck, right?
Exactly.
You had a terrible decision-making process, or you threw caution to the wind and really just, flipped a coin and hoped that you would get heads, and you did. And so you're like, oh wow, let me reward that decision-making process, which might have not been a process at all. Or you can make the right decision. You can have a good process, and the deck is just stacked against you.
Exactly.
Doesn't mean that you should stop making decisions that way.
Exactly.
Right. So you really have to zoom out, this makes me also think of many other things. Right. And on some level, all of life is investing. Right. You have finite time, finite energy, finite capital, and even if the markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, which is part of the reason why really good poker players who are thinking systematically also understand the importance of having a bankroll, right?
Right.
Because if they have a string of bad luck, even with really, really good strategy and decision making, they need to be able to weather a series of bad hands, for instance. This is just such a critical distinction, and I don't want to belabor it, but I think it's something that I'd love to hear a little more about, if you could personalize it. So,
okay.
How do you implement this yourself, or how have you, in terms of doing post-game analysis on decisions?
Right. I think, at the business level, the poker analogy is perfect, because people don't realize how much is luck in real life, whether it's an invention or an innovation or launching a new product. So in the business level, and I'll tell you kind of a totally different angle, personal level, but at the business level, there are some pretty good teams or companies that will try to do a postmortem after some product launches, and they'll analyze, but they're still at that level one of outcome mindset of, we did pawn takes bishop and it didn't work, so let's not do pawn. So they say, we launched the product and it didn't have this feature, and customers liked this feature, and that's why it didn't go as well. So let's make sure we have this feature. So you're still on kind of level one. The really, really great teams and companies, and not that many of them, say, how did we arrive at that decision to launch that product at that time? How did we make that decision? Who was involved in the decision? What information did they have? Is that the right people to be making are we making the decisions in the right way? Are we presenting the people who are making the decisions with the right information at the right time, analyzed in the right way? And you see the difference. In one case, you just learn, let's not put feature X on product Y. In the other case, you learn something that can apply to 500 different products. Let's think about how we tweak our decision-making process in the future. So that's sort of system versus outcome mindset on the, on the business side.
If I could pause for 1 second. So on the business side, and this might apply elsewhere, are there other questions you could ask when trying to decipher what your decision-making process was? Why did we think it was a good idea? What were we missing, right? What information didn't we have until too late? Or I don't know what the right selection of questions would be.
Oh, yeah. So there's so many. Like, what are people's individual incentives? The people who are involved in the decision, so few people ask that question. Are they really incentivized by the project launch, or do they have some other thing? Like, are they really focused on promotion? So how does being focused on promotion, how did that affect the decision? And if we altered their incentives, might they have arrived at a different decision? So people rarely ask, let's just think about the X number of people who are involved in the decision. Let's walk through one by one, what are their incentives? Let's just have even a 20-minute conversation. Do we really think the incentives are the right incentives that are giving us the decision, that are aligning people with the outcome, or not? How are people communicating? How are people exchanging ideas? Are they meeting the day of? Whose set of analyses are they looking at? Somebody who really knows what they're doing or not? And did they get presented the right data at the right time to make the most informed? Now, the real key is, as you sort of said with luck and cards, you want to do this for not just for failures. That's the wrong. You want to do it as much, if not more, for successes. You might have just gotten lucky. Those are the most dangerous traps. Let's say you kick, you kick a soccer ball into the goal, and you were 5 feet in front of the goalkeeper, and you kick right at the goalkeeper. It just happens that the goalkeeper slipped on the mud or whatever. It was raining, but you kicked right at the goalkeeper, and you got to go. Does that mean you should keep kicking right at the goalkeeper? That's the right strategy? No, you just got lucky. Yeah, you won the game and maybe the world championship, but you got lucky. Do you want to do that again next time? No. You bet on some dumb internet stock and it quadrupled or something, and you had no idea what you were doing, and you were drunk when you made the investment, but you made quadruple your money. So does that tell you want to be drunk before every investment and not look at any due diligence? No, you got lucky. So it's more important to actually look at the successes and think about how do I make that decision than it is the failure, because everybody thinks hard about a failure. People rarely think about, did I get lucky? They like to say, oh, I was my genius, blah, blah, blah. So it's more important as a team to say, all right, this worked. Where did we get lucky? Where do we actually had flaws in our process that we need to adjust next time in how we made we were uninformed, and we simply got lucky. Our competitor stumbled. We just got lucky. So we really shouldn't. The reason that's more important is because it cements bad habits.
Yeah.
This is what we did last time. We got drunk before we made an investment, and it was a great investment. Let's get drunk again and make another investment. It cements bad habits because you confuse good outcome with good decision-making. So that's on the business side. So it can have a pretty big effect on the personal side as well. Like, one example is, I'll give one example for married people, one example for single people. So a single one I actually did use. A little personal, but whatever. Again, it's just you and me, right?
It's just us.
Okay, good. Again, married people, let's say you get into an argument with your significant other, and you find yourself getting into an argument. You say something about, I don't know, whatever, the dishes, or you say something about the driving, or you say something, and, it leads into an argument. And then the outcome mindset is like, well, I said something about the dishes. Don't say something about the dishes in the future. So guess what's going to happen? You're going to have the same kind of argument about 57 other subjects because you're not getting at the root. What were you thinking when you said that thing about the dishes? Why were you thinking it? What state of mind were you in? Maybe you're frustrated about something at work, as an example, and you're mentioning some nagging comment.
Right. Was the problem really about the problem?
Right. And then you say, now I have a flaw in my system where I'm frustrated at work, and then it comes out as a comment about something that just is a bad idea. It's a bad out. So maybe rather than just say, don't ask about the dishes next time, and it comes out, say, if I'm frustrated at work, what else can I do other than make comments about the dishes? Like, can I set up a punching bag, and just start hitting the punching bag and take a shower, and then I'm in a better mood and I don't give a shit about dishes or whatever. So you find, what were you thinking at the time when you made that comment? Is there a tweak to your decision-making process so that you don't make not just that comment, not pawn takes bishop, but many other similar things? So that's married life, for example, personal example. Single life. Actually, when you and I knew each other, both were single. I take you're still. We haven't caught up in a couple of years.
We haven't. I actually have a wonderful girlfriend I've been with for a while now, and things are going extremely well. So we can talk more about that.
Okay, we'll talk more about that later. But so I was living in Manhattan as a single guy, and the company that I was running was in Boston. So I was just commuting back and forth, and I didn't have almost any social life because there's so much time in the plane and then dealing with running a business. So I would set up these gatherings, some of which you came to, I remember, in my apartment. And I called them SWAE, scientists, writers, artists, and entrepreneurs. And then eventually I added, mostly because I was trying to exclude them, and eventually I just became explicit, no BLC. No bankers, lawyers, or consultants.
Which one should note you used to be at McKinsey, which is great.
Right.
So no bankers, lawyers, or consultants.
Right. Self-hating consultant. So I call them SWAE, no BLC, also because I just don't remember stuff unless I have it like a silly acronym or something.
Yeah.
And so I call them SWAE, no BLC. And as soon as I said, especially when I added the no BLC, like interest skyrocketed. Especially from the BLC crowd. Like my banker, lawyer, or consultant friends were like, can I come? I'm like, wait a minute, what part of like no BLC? I just said no BLC. And like, yeah, but can I come? Can you make an exception? I'm like, that's weird. And then single women in Manhattan, like really interesting, intelligent, attractive women friends that we would be like, I am so there. I so want to come. And then I realized, I was sort of out of it, but I realized like there was such frustration among really intelligent women, professional women. They were so tired of like the same old, because New York is full of these, really ambitious bankers who are just focused on banking, and they were so curious to meet scientists. Right? So for me, I see scientists all day long, and writers I was sort of curious about, and entrepreneurs. But anyway, it ended up becoming this really fun thing, and I went out on a series of dates, but for probably 10 years, I never really we're coming to the like system outcome versus in dating.
I'm not in any rush.
Okay.
No. I'm loving this. So take your time.
So, you, Tim, I remember coming to these sort of SWAE, no BLC events. Oren Hoffman, my friend, used to come to these things, and they were awesome. And so I ended up having some decent dating life because I would do these things mostly just because I was not around very often. I would just pick a day and then everybody would be there. And 5 years, sort of 10 years, I was sort of single guy in Manhattan, and a friend liked to describe it as, you have junk eating with you just move from car. It was sort of like junk dating. Like there's a high on the first date, and then that high is still sort of there on the second date, and then it fades on the third date, and so then you go to the next one because there's a high. And so Manhattan life is full of this sort of junk dating, like you have the junk eating thing, you go from one to another, and then it's really a bad place for dating, I think, because you never there's so many carbs around. So, everyone's looking for the next shiny penny, and you don't actually take the time to really relish and savor and get past a couple little speed bumps to find what's really valuable underneath. Anyway, I'd been dating 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and at that point, my father had gotten ill and then passed away from cancer, from a rare type of leukemia. And that, I think, gave me a mind shift. Like, what am I doing here? And I had been doing this sort of mindless, kind of like the Gary Kasparov, pawn takes bishop. Well, that didn't work out with that dating thing, so let me not date, some woman who looks like this or is in the profession Y or has this characteristic. So, okay, so that solves, that's one pawn takes bishop. Don't do this move. Don't do that move. But I'd never stepped back and said, like, what am I just systematically? Like, what's wrong here? Like, why have I, not dated anyone for more than 2 months or 3 months in a bunch of years? And I took a weekend and I just said, all right, let me try to be really honest with myself. Like, I do want something more serious. I want a life partner. Let me just think through, the last 10 or 20 dates that I've gone or women that I've gone on some kind of date with. Like, why did it not develop? Is there any pattern here? What was I thinking what was your decision-making process that you want to... And then when I was pretty honest about it and stepped back and looked at it from view above, there was a pattern that came out and I was like, this is stupid. I'm doing this same pattern over and over and I need to be thinking in a completely different way, and I need to be making my decisions about who I date and why I date them in a totally different way.
I know we're getting into like a therapy session here, or a lot of personal details, but are you open to sharing what the pattern was?
It was getting a little. This is just between you and me, right?
It's just between you and me.
Okay, got it. I think one of the lessons there is that no matter how self-aware you think you are, you're really influenced by your surroundings a lot more, or at least I was, really influenced by who I was surrounded with more than I appreciated. I thought, I'm my own person, it doesn't matter. But at the time, I had a number of friends who were in the film and fashion world, and so I didn't have a lot of time to arrange social life stuff because I was flying all over. And so I would go to social events with them, and they were really interested in other film and fashion. So a lot of my dates were like film and fashion, or occasionally I would, meet some other variants. And they were really especially interested in kind of some of the more superficial qualities and sort of fast dating based on like superficial stuff and how people look or how people talk. And as much as I thought I was a good guy, I sort of fell into that trap. And of dating based on much more superficial. And because I was able to like make conversation reasonably well and have a good time, I could have a fun first or second, and then kind of fool myself into thinking, I really connect with this person because look at these really interesting conversations. You mentioned Richard Feynman. One of the great Feynman quotes is, the most important thing is not to fool yourself. And you need to remember that you're the easiest person to fool. And I was fooling myself. I was saying, I'm really into that person because they're a great people person and we have all these great people insights. Meanwhile, the person wants to go to clubs at, midnight or 1 a.m. And like, that's the last thing I have any interest in doing. And so when I said, I'm really being influenced, I need to just step out of this. I need to actually break up with some of my guy friends. Which is a weird thing to think, but you get kind of reliant, and then you just sort of follow. I need to break up because this is influencing me, and I need to make different decisions about who I want to go out on dates with because that stuff is not really me. It's not deeply it's not who I am at my core, and I'm making the first few conversations fun, but then I'm getting bored. And I had an old friend who told me there was sort of 2 criteria for finding the right life partner. He was a New York guy, and he was an older guy, and he was a mentor and he very successful, also very good looking, very sort of classic Midwest gentleman, and been very successful in dating. And I'd learned a lot because he was on his third wife. This is a footnote, but very happily married. And I think you learn more from failure, obviously, than success. So he'd learned a lot, and he said just 2 criteria. 1, mental health, and especially in Manhattan, that's a pretty high bar. And 2, find somebody you like having dinner with, because you can be having a lot of dinners together. And if that's not appealing to you, it's going to be a tough marriage. And the physical stuff takes care of itself, because you won't be there. But that was just a great
physical stuff, meaning it's either there or it isn't.
Yeah, and you know that within the first few, and you're just not going to go there. And it's so overrated. It's so overemphasized anyway. That's not something you need to think about. What's underemphasized is
stuff you're more likely to miss.
And it's just a really great, straightforward litmus test. How much do you like having dinner together? And what I realized is, like, when I went back and looked, I wouldn't rank high, how much I like to have dinner with, the people I'd been dating. And so that's what I started looking for. People who were more just an intellectual mind fit for me and less worried about any of the other stuff, less worried what any friend would think or anybody would think or anyone around me. So you're smiling.
I'm smiling because I want to ask just a few follow-up questions, and I know that I'm jumping in a lot, but this is what I do anyway. Like if we were having drinks, I'd be doing exactly the same thing. You mentioned peer group, and there's sort of at least two components of, I would imagine, making a shift. One is breaking up with some of your friends, and then the other is gathering the people you hope to be positively influenced by.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people listening, the latter part is the easier part. And like adding more people is the easier part. Did you break up with your friends by doing the slow drift, where it's like by the time you were gone, they didn't really notice because it was very gradual, or did you do it more directly? How did you break up with people?
Well, firstly, we're guys, so we don't talk about,
guys
don't really, I think women have a much more communicative thing, and guys are just like, oh, whatever. Like, he didn't answer a couple texts, so, whatever. It's also Manhattan.
Yeah.
So, the social life is like, let's text, 10 friends at 5 p.m. and see what's going on at 7 p.m. And, whichever 2 you find me. And so after a while, you don't answer some of those texts. It's like, So breaking up in Manhattan with some guy friends turns out,
not to be a heavy lift.
But of course, it depends on the guy, But yeah, it is breaking out, and then finding people who you think are more resonant. You really kind of excite you, and you really enjoy, and are more the way you want to be aspirationally, how you want to live your life. Through that process, not long after I did that system mindset as opposed to outcome mindset on dating, I went out on a couple of days, and they were just totally different level. I enjoyed them at a much different level because I was really, how much am I genuinely enjoying dinner, as opposed to how much am I, telling stories and trying to be funny, and it was funny and she laughed and that's great. Let's go to bed or whatever.
Right.
This thing's not on, right?
No, the mics are off.
Okay, good. That's great. So that never happened, by the way, honey. You're the first, really. I'm going to be in trouble. Anywho,
we have magic in post-production if needed.
Anyway, so no, it just started, and very shortly thereafter, I was sort of set up on a introduction. I call it a date. My wife calls it a business meeting. So there's a slightly different perspective here. I don't know if you know this story. Do you know this? Because you were at the wedding.
I was at the wedding, but I don't know this part.
Okay, so I was at a cocktail event at there was a theater group. Actually, Catherine was at the wedding too, who was responsible for all this. There was a theater production group in New York, and they had their annual gala, and I, went to raise the flag and support, but it was full of kind of artists and theater people that I didn't know the first thing about theater or all this stuff. So I would just like went online for a drink just to like hide out and have an excuse not to talk to people. And there was a guy standing next to me who said, "Oh, hey, my name is so. What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, I do medical research." Because in New York, nobody knows or at the time, nobody knew what biotech was. And he said, "Oh, that's interesting. My ex-girlfriend does cancer research in Boston." And I'm all of a sudden like, my ears perk up, my antenna goes up like ding, 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 ding. Really? Because this was a pretty good-looking dude. He was kind of this tall and, nice-looking guy, and he was clearly well-adjusted and kind of a likable guy. And I thought, A, cancer research in Boston, that's what I do. B, if this guy's pretty good-looking, his ex-girlfriend is probably pretty hot. C, she's probably pretty well-adjusted, because if, most women in science there's so few that they just, the guys are like sharks. But if she can interest a guy who doesn't know any science, who's pure arts, she must be kind of a well-rounded personality. So A, B, C. I'm like, ding, 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 ding. And because I was already on the lookout because of this system mindset, like whom I'm dating. And so within about the first 30 milliseconds, I'm like, how can I stalk this guy electronically tomorrow, figure out who his ex-girlfriend is, and then somehow accidentally arrange to bump into her? And this was all like within the first, few seconds. And then
right, he's just talking. You're not
he's
hearing
just
any of
talking.
it.
I'm just like mentally, like how
planning the next day.
Planning like tomorrow. I'm going to figure out like, does he know the woman who's hosting? And then can I find out like what his last name is? And anyway, I'm doing all these calculations in my head. And then so he says, that's so when he asks, like how do what's your connection? I explain, I run a biotech. I said, I run a biotech company in Boston and cancer research. Who's her advisor? Oh, I know that guy. Da 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 da. And he says, "Oh, do you mind if I introduce you? Because she might be interested in a job in industry." And I'm thinking like, ding, 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 ding. Yeah. But I'm sort of calm, like, sure. Well, I'll see if I can make the time for that meeting. And so then I go home, and the next morning I'm thinking, all right, what are the odds? It's Saturday night in New York. Some guy in line for a drink tells you something about his ex-girlfriend that he's actually going to follow through. This is less than 10% chance, right? So I'm already thinking, like, how do I figure out who this guy was? And then I get this email. And he's like, "Oh, Safi and Magda, I want to introduce you. Magda's interested in so-and-so. And Safi does... such and such." And later I found out he'd Googled me, and there was this kind of profile written about me online, and there was a little video, and so he'd forwarded all that stuff to her. I didn't know that at the time. But anyways, so I get this email, and then so 10 milliseconds later I Google her, and out comes this like model pose. Like this, like, and I'm like, what the freaking hell? That's a cancer biology PhD who's a postdoc at Harvard? Oh my God, I am so taking this meeting. And so then I arranged to meet her, and then we meet up 1 week later, and it was supposed to be like just a coffee after. It's the least romantic. I was down at the Dana-Farber Cancer Center for some meetings, and she was working right nearby, so we met at the like Longwood Medical Galleria. The least, doctors in scrubs everywhere, and it's just like fast food court, and like there's some cheesy little hotel there with its cheesy little restaurant. I forgot the name, and I sit down. 5 o'clock. It's supposed to be a 30-minute coffee, and it turns into 5 hours. And like I don't even notice the time. And for the first time, I feel like I'm not trying.
Yeah.
I'm not like trying to be entertaining or tell a story or blah, blah, blah. It's just like, this is the actual me. And she's like a female version of me. Not really, but like female version minus 14 years and, very attractive and all sorts of other, and from the Czech Republic, not from Israel and New Jersey. But other than that, just
other than very similar.
Those little things, but she really cared about science and the search for truth and family and really didn't care for anything else. Like all the stuff of the glitz or, financial or material stuff. And, that is really sadly pretty common in Manhattan. She just had no interest. She just liked the science she was doing and figuring out good science, and she cared deeply about family And that was it. And she knew what she cared about. And she clearly just had fantastic values. And I was like, this woman is awesome.
How did it work out?
And I would say 8 months later, you got the wedding invitation.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Beautiful wedding.
Thank you.
Also.
Thank you.
And so this is I like the weaving that we're doing from sort of personal to business, because it's same but different, right? Like a lot of the thought processes behind them. And one thing I was hoping to do today also, which you're doing a great job of doing yourself, but is humanizing you in the sense that if I read a very simple bio of you, but if we got into a lot of the details, you can be very intellectually intimidating. I think you could be. You're a very smart guy, and there's no doubt some hardwiring that helps with that. But you also use systems, and you enable yourself with tools. And so you mentioned no BLC, right? And you said very quickly in passing, well, I can't remember anything unless I use acronyms. So let's talk about acronyms just for a second, because this type of shorthand can be really helpful. What other acronyms have you used? And there are a whole bunch that pop up. I mean, literally many acronyms that you use. So I'm looking at one here, but you can start with anyone you like. One, FBR, right? FBR. What the hell does that mean? But what are some other, whether it's sort of heuristics or acronyms that you use to help perform better, make better decisions, anything?
All right. Right, FBR. Okay, so that's one of the writing rules of thumb that I learned that was one of the most important writing. I broke, after a year or two or three, I kind of broke out writing for myself into style, story, and process. And I had
style, story, and process.
So I had kind of 5 rules on style that I worked on and iterated. I had kind of 5 rules on story that I worked on and iterated, and 5 rules on just writing process, which is sort of writing routine. But probably one of the most important ones on the routine and process was write FBR. So that stands for right, fast, bad, and wrong. And the reason that that's so important is that, especially if you have any kind of perfectionistic tendencies, and I know a lot of people write about this, but FBR is what resonated for me and how I remember it. It just means when you're starting to write, let's say you found the idea and the narrative thread and the thing that the wheels are turning and you think you can see, the fog. It's like driving, and you can only see a few feet ahead because you're in a fog, and it's sort of the mist clearing, like, oh, I see where I'm going with this thing. Well, let's just go. The inclination is, when you write a sentence or a paragraph or the first couple of paragraphs, is to stop and backtrack either for style or for facts. Like I'm doing nonfiction, right? So I'm not doing fiction. So, in such and such date, this guy did this thing and then he did that thing. Like, was it really that date? Then let's go check the internet. So you want to write so that is a disaster. You'll never get anything done if you do that. So the trick is to go exactly 180, especially if you haven't write FBR, write fast, bad, and wrong. Put the wrong date. You don't get the style, the sentence doesn't sound good, great. Write fast, write bad, and write wrong. Do terrible style, terrible grammar, terrible word choice, wrong facts, and that liberates you. That liberates you to follow the narrative thread and just keep going and going with it and not stop and backtrack. Because every time you stop, maybe it's like a car going down the highway, it's easy to stop, but then you have to spend all this fuel to get back up to speed, and you might not get there. Yeah. So once you're finally going, what you often discover, you write a lot too, is once you start writing and start pulling on that narrative thread, it's just really surprising where it goes. But only if you go fast. Yeah. Not if you go slow. Not if you say, oh, was it 1941 he did this, or was it 1939? Mm-hmm. Was he with this person, or was he with that person? Am I spelling his name correctly? Let's go check on the internet. Then you've lost the thread. And what it hurts on many levels. Not only do you get less done, but you lose the creativity. Because it's only when you're at high speed to like, and the wheels are turning, and you're like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, I could go here. And oh, I could go there. And oh, I could go here. Like when you're driving fast, you can make a left turn. It has a big impact.
Yeah.
But not when you're driving slow.
I was just thinking, creativity, and there are many different types of creativity, but it's in some ways a lot like riding a bike, right? It's easier at slightly higher speeds.
Exactly.
Right. You try to ride a bicycle really, really slowly, and you're twisting and turning and trying to keep your balance, and it's herky-jerky, and the stopping and starting, that task switching is really expensive.
It's funny you're saying that, because the physics of that is the angular momentum of the wheels.
Yeah.
And once you have high angular momentum, you're much more stable than at low angular momentum.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to digress into motorcycles for a second, but of course, part of the fun of having our conversations is that it's just a beautiful medley of digressions. But trying to maintain some semblance of professional podcasting protocol.
By the way, we could go on a motorcycle digression too. I got motorcycle story, but that's another. You're in charge. You go wherever you want to go.
We'll come back to motorcycles. We're going to segue to other subject areas, but we're not going to go through all of the rules for style, story, and process, but I'm curious particularly about process, but it could be any. Are there any other rules that you have found to be particularly valuable for writing that jump to mind?
It's the hats. For me, I realized, and again, a lot of this stuff took a long time. There are two hats you wear on reading, and there are three hats you wear on writing. And you just want to be very clear about what hat you're wearing when, so you don't confuse them. And then you're much more efficient. You asked about acronyms. I have some really silly, I don't think I've ever said these out loud. It's more like inner voice acronyms. Since you're an old friend.
That's what I want.
And this thing is definitely not on. So in reading, there are two modes, two hats you wear, or at least for me. And the first one I call RICLS, and the second one I call REAS.
Okay, I like it.
You're laughing. I could tell it's like silly and stupid, but that's how I think about it. RICLS is reading for information, content, lessons. R-I-C.
Whatever it is.
Whatever it is. RICLS. Reading for information, content, lessons, and stories. RICLS. And so that's for the raw meat. If you're writing nonfiction narrative, that's for like the raw meat of the facts or the ideas or the story. And you're really reading for information, for content, and for lessons.
And when you say reading, are you referring to research that you're doing?
Research.
Got it.
So that's the research. Let's say you're writing about World War II. Then that's in RICLS. You're reading very fast, if you as fast as you can and as deeply as you can, and chasing different threads and different footnotes and different archival. And that is the RICLS hat. You're reading for the information, for the content, or for the lessons you want to use, or for the stories you want to tell. RICLS. Totally different hat is REAS. Reading for ear, art, and skill. REAS. So when I was reading Nabokov, for example, I was reading for kind of the musical rhythm and the pacing and the tricks that he uses on transitions and or others. He wasn't the only one I did that. Donald Hall, whose book Essays After Eight, he was again, I'm kind of ignorant when it comes to literature. A lot of people knew this. I did. He was a poet laureate. He's a poet.
Yeah, the first time I'm hearing his name.
I remember talking to some English friends, and they laughed at me that I didn't know who he was. But anyway, some friend had sent me this essays, and I picked that up. And as a poet, he also has incredible word choice and rhythm and pacing. And it's very different than Nabokov. Nabokov is fun, but it completely eccentric and a completely unique style that only applies if you're a Russian emigre who plays with the dictionary for fun. So it's not relevant for copying anyway. It's just interesting to develop ear. But Nabokov is cold. He's clearly, as he's writing, for entertaining himself with language. He doesn't have any, he was the first to say, I don't have any messages, I don't have any morals, and you can sort of tell he doesn't really care about his characters. He's just plain. He's playing with language. Hall is warm. He wrote, he just passed away, sadly. He wrote so movingly and sparingly about incredibly deep emotional personal things. You know, his love affair with his, how he fell in love with his, wife, and how he thought she would outlive him, and how they made all these plans, and then she came down at an early age with leukemia, and he just couldn't believe that he was out burying her, and she was but he writes it in not a maudlin way at all, and he writes it so beautifully and so powerfully and so tightly. So I read Hall for How Do You Write About Emotion, which I had zero experience, especially as a scientist. Emotion was not like a top skill of mine, and communicating emotion was not something I had any skill in doing. So I read him not only for the beautiful but very different writing style, but also for how do you write about emotion, how do you write about people, how do you write about characters in a kind of a poetic way, not overtelling, but using as few words as possible. Anyway, that's REAS.
So I want to pause for 1 second, because I've been able to see the output of that in Loonshots, for instance, in the very beginning, in some of the stories that you tell with patients. Right? It's a great example of like the output of training that ability that you did not consider yourself as, that faculty that you didn't consider yourself as having had developed, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I want to, I'm not going to, well, I am going to interrupt, but not for very long, because I do want to get to the writing side. But I want to underscore for folks who are like, why are we talking about writing with a physicist, biotech, entrepreneur? And the reason we're talking about it is because it's same but different. What I'm really fascinated by is how you structure your thinking and question and stress test your thinking. So just for people who are like, why are we talking about writing? That's why. So please continue.
Okay, so you asked about acronym or the other writing lesson was these multiple hats. So in reading, it was RICLS. Now I'm going to put on my hat. It has nothing to do with style, so just shut off that part of the brain. You're reading really fast for a story or a content, and then REAS, I'm reading for ear, art, and skill. So it's just pure writing skill. And so the way I train for it is to think strategically about where am I weak. So I can explain a technical idea pretty well. That's what I've been doing my whole life, whether in academic science or running a biotech company, trying to explain technical stuff about how a drug works or the biology or chemistry to people who are not as technical. So explaining an idea I can do, even in plain English, but books that just explain ideas are boring. I don't even like reading them. People don't really connect to ideas. People connect to people. If you can tell a story about people through which an idea is revealed, that's the best of all worlds. So just talking about ideas is so-so. Just talking about people, then you're sort of a fairy tale. But if you can combine the two, tell stories of people through which an underlying idea is revealed and through which is connected by an underlying idea, which is what I tried to do in this book, that's, for me, the grander challenge. That was really kind of a big challenge. How do you not do A and not do B, but do the combination of A and B? And so I was not good at telling stories of people. You don't really do that in academic science. You write a paper, you're not going to write a paper saying, well, let me tell you about the day I first had this idea and then I was wrong about this and then Joe. That's not how you write an academic paper. And when you run a biotech company, you're at you do your earnings call if you're public, or you're at an investment meeting and you do your 25-minute roadshow. Let me tell you a story about how, the failures and the characters and the no, they're like, what was your R&D spend?
Just the facts, ma'am.
Just the facts.
So we've talked about the two hats of reading. What are the three hats of writing?
The three hats of writing, there's hunting, or the way I think about it is there's hunting, there's drafting, and there's editing. So in hunting, you're looking for the narrative thread that's going to hold your story together, or if you're doing nonfiction, the series of stories and the series of anecdotes and the lesson you're going to draw. So that's the hunting. The drafting is where you're writing FBR, fast, bad, and wrong, just as fast as you can. And then the editing is where it all comes together, and you try to make it, you get rid of all the glitches and make it shine. And, as we're talking, I was thinking about this movie you took me to see, this premiere you took me to see yesterday by Robert Rodriguez, where he made this kind of amazing movie for $7,000. And before that, he was talking about a masterclass. He was doing his masterclass in film, and which was just really a masterclass in creativity. And he was talking about how in film, he thinks of making a film as also in 3 stages, like cooking, where you write your recipe, then you go grocery shopping, and then you do the editing at the end, is like you're cooking. And I think it's very similar in writing. The hunting, the finding the narrative thread is like your recipe. The drafting fast, bad, and wrong, the FBR, writing as fast as you can, is like going to a supermarket and just filling your cart as fast as you can with all this stuff. And then it all comes together in the editing. So it's actually very interesting hearing that from Robert Rodriguez, because it just reminded me of the kind of the 3 hats that I wear when I'm writing.
Well, it maps almost perfectly to it. And he used index cards, like a pack of index cards you can get for probably $1 or $2. And he's like, this could change your life. Like one pack of index cards, and he'll lay it on the floor and then rearrange the order and so on. So like you said, that's the hunting for the structure, right? Or the arc. And then same as you know, fast, bad, and wrong in quick drafting, and then assembling it. And in some respects with film, I know it's slightly different, but improvising on the fly when things go wrong or other opportunities present themselves on the actual, say, set or day of shooting. When you are doing the hunting, did you have, for instance, a within chapter structure that you tried to stick to? Were there common ingredients with a chapter where you would try to, say, start with a story, then add facts, then close with a story? Or did you look at it as more of an arc and a build over the course of the book, or perhaps both? How did you approach the hunting portion?
I'd love to say I had a system or method, but absolutely not. I literally started with a blank page and almost panicked. I actually had to learn. I had one of my rules is patience over panic, because you start with a blank page, and I just had absolutely no idea what was going to happen, where it was going to go, what story. I end up with all these kind of crazy stories. In fact, actually, probably the nicest thing somebody said to me about the book, it was this guy named Bob Sutton, who wrote this book called The No Asshole Rule.
Yeah,
very funny guy.
Bob's a good guy.
Very funny guy. We were having beers at the Dutch Goose in Menlo Park, which I used to go to 20 years ago, and he's been like a lifelong customer since he was like 12. And we're in like the second or third beer, and there's another author friend of ours there. And at some point he turns to me and he goes, your book? And I go, yeah. I said, man, that was some wacky shit. And I feel like that's some, because, I did Pan Am and Einstein and Kepler and Steve Jobs and U-boats. And I feel like in some ways that was like the nicest thing anybody said to me.
Oh, yeah. I think wacky shit is a strong endorsement.
Yeah. And I when you ask, like, what did I do to get these like wacky stories in each chapter, all of them are so different. Like, comparing one trip at Pan Am with Bob Kahneman in American, or Steve Jobs and Jeff Raskin versus Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke, comparing across 2 centuries. I have absolutely no clue where I would just lock myself in my little cave, shut the blinds, and I would disappear into some zone, and then I would reemerge at 5:30 to pick up my daughter from daycare, and I'd look at where the hell did that come from? I have no idea. So to answer your question, I would just look at a blank page, and then I'd look up at 5:30, and this weird, what did he call it? Wacky shit was just all over. And that's the grocery shopping. We were talking about the Robert Rodriguez film, and it's once you start, that's the advantage of writing FBR, writing fast, bad, wrong, is that once you start going at high speed, just like all this stuff,
the speed is really important.
Yeah, and I've always thought, since I sort of have 3 rules for everything, creativity for me is about speed, attention, and courage. You want to go as fast as you can. Like for me, getting the stories is about speed reading. So I read through I had so many sources and I think I have like about 5,000 files. I scanned almost all the books, so I have everything electronic, and I could search in the database electronically. I was just reading as fast as I could because eventually that's number two. First is speed, second is attention, because you want to be reading as fast as you can, and all of a sudden there's a tiny little thing like, whoa, wait, what? And that's where you go. The visual I have, because I have sort of a visual for everything, is that there's this dense forest of stuff, which is all the facts and data and stories. And there's this beautiful clearing on the inside, which is like a central core idea. And you're looking for the path in. And so you're running around the circle as fast as you can, and you're looking for like a path in or something to guide. Maybe you're looking for like a little red sparrow that's like hiding, that's going to peek out behind a little leaf or a tree. And you're running, or you're looking and running as fast as you can. And then all of a sudden you see that. So you need speed, you need attention to keep your eye out for that tiny little, red sparrow to say, I'm over here, this is the path. And then you need courage, because it may look like a really wacky sparrow. You need to have some balls to really follow that idea, because your first thought is there's just no way. There's no way I could compare Steve Jobs and Isaac Newton. That's absurd. Well, let me pull on that a little bit more. Oh, it turns out Steve Jobs didn't really develop the Macintosh. He had this assistant named, no, he didn't have an assistant. There was a guy working at Apple who had been working on this project that he called the Macintosh project for, a year or two before Jobs. And he tried to interest Jobs in it, and Jobs dismissed it. And eventually, just because by default, after Jobs had kind of messed up the Lisa and the Apple III, that was the only project they could, find. And history got rewritten that he invented it. That's not really what happened. But that's kind of what happened with Isaac Newton. Oh, he just came up with the idea of gravity. Well, actually, there was a guy who was much less charismatic, much less good communicator, named Robert Hooke, who came up with a couple of the central ideas of gravity. And he sort of fed them to Isaac Newton. And then Isaac Newton ran with it, just like Jeff Raskin kind of fed the ideas of a graphical user interface and a small computer called the Macintosh. It already had the name, to Steve Jobs. Now, Steve Jobs was a much more charismatic, much better communicator, in some ways much more ambitious, and shoved him aside, just like Isaac Newton had a lot of skills that the other guy didn't have. Steve Jobs was a great synthesizer. He could bring in marketing and motivate people the way that Jeff Raskin couldn't. I realize we're going on a really long tangent here.
It's okay.
But Isaac Newton also, had some better skills, but he was really fed the early ideas by a guy named Robert Hooke. So for creativity, what I found is like speed, attention, and courage, because you have to say the idea of comparing Steve Jobs and Jeff Raskin with Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke sounds nuts. Who would ever do that? But you have to have some balls to go after that.
It strikes me also that one could look at it not just as a potential sequence, but also as a hierarchy, in the sense that if you don't have speed, you're not going to be able to develop the 360-degree view to have the attention yield any fruit. So you need to have that as almost a precursor to the attention. Then the attention is a precursor to the courage, which is sort of the execution on what you find, that little red sparrow.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's in order: speed, attention, courage. And that's kind of what I found for me was the secret of creating wacky shit.
And if we come out again to look at the world of business, and not fooling yourself or not confusing process and outcome, and trying to really have to read something correctly. And I should note also that these different hats and these different heuristics for being clear on your purpose before, say, reading a book or selecting a book in the first place is really, really, really important. And I'll give an example that illustrates this in a very different context. So Tony Robbins does an exercise at some of his events where he'll ask people to scan the room, and he'll say, before you scan the room, I want you to note anything red, of reddish hue, remotely close. And they do that for 60 seconds. And then he says, all right, run through the list of all the things that you saw that were red. And then he asks people, now note without looking around the room what you saw that was blue.
Right.
And people can't do it.
Right.
And it's to have that search function sort of set in place before reading a book, before editing,
right,
is really, 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 really critical. Let's talk about, and I think the term that you use is false failures or...
False failure, right.
Let's talk about that for a second, because it also might tie into someone we mentioned at the very beginning of the conversation, who is Peter Thiel. But can you talk about what a false fail or false failure is?
So false fail is the idea, let's say you're nurturing some crazy idea that everybody thinks is nuts, which I call, for lack of a better word, I call that a loonshot rather than a moonshot. Moonshot, everybody knows there's a big goal and an exciting destination, but the big ideas that really make that transform, whether it's an industry or science or even world history, almost never arrive dazzling everybody with their brilliance. They tend to be the ones that are floating around for years or sometimes decades, and the people championing them are written off as nuts. In the revisionist history, looking back, it's like, oh, it's obvious that it was right. It's sort of a natural tendency. You assume that, and that guy was obviously a genius, but most people don't talk about the fact that everyone said he was an idiot for 20 years, including some of the most famous people and famous discoveries we know of. But what you see with Loonshots, with these crazy ideas, is very often people give up on them because of what you might call a false fail. Because, and by a false fail, I mean it was a flaw in the experiment rather than the idea. The outcome is the same. The experiment gave a negative result and everybody walks away. In science, that's the case. The experiment gave a negative result, everybody walks away. But the problem is not with the idea, it's with the experiment. So the example, you mentioned Peter Thiel. So the example I use is, I think I might have first heard about this from Ken Howery. It's probably another mutual friend.
Yeah.
So I think Ken was telling me this one time over drinks. This was like many years ago.
Yeah, Ken, who was at PayPal with Peter, part of the PayPal mafia.
That's right. I think they knew each other from Stanford days or something like that.
And then later Founders Fund and so on.
So Ken had started working with Peter on his private investments. This was just a few months or a year before it turned into Founders Fund. And so he was kind of helping him out. And he mentioned that this guy Zuckerberg had come by, Mark Zuckerberg, with this idea for a social network. And social networks had been around for, a decade at that point, and they'd all gone nowhere. There was a dozen of them. And you and I can remember all these crazy names of all these things, Small World, whatever, all these things that went and flamed out. And at the time, there was another one that was rising, was sort of the popular one at the time, called Friendster, which some people may remember. And that was just starting to flame out, and people were leaving Friendster for the new thing at the time, which was called MySpace. So when Zuckerberg was going around, Ken was telling me the story, everybody had kind of passed on investing because everybody said, well, look at all the social network. Everybody,
Bishop takes pawn.
They said all these guys fail, and you know why they fail? We know why they fail because you can see that all these users are hopping from network to network, and that's the outcome, right? That's the Bishop take pawn. It lost the game. All these social networks are going nowhere. There's no money in them. So no, we're not giving our money to this Zuckerberg kid or whatever his name is. And Ken and Peter said, is that really why they're failing? Let's take a look. And so they had friends behind the scenes at Friendster. I don't remember if they were investors or not or whatever, but it's a small community. And they said, let's ask for the data, for the user retention data. People are clearly fleeing. And we know that they were using Friendster, and the website was kind of glitchy and it was sort of crashing. So they got the data on the user retention in Friendster, and they found, holy crap, like people are staying on this site for hours. Now, this is a site that's crappy. No offense to whoever's listening who is part of that team, but like this site is crashing all the time. And they happen to know that they'd been given advice on like, listen, you need to build, you've scaled from a few users to like a few million. You need to improve your systems because your site is glitchy. And what they realized is that people were staying on for hours, even though it was a crappy, glitchy website. And that the MySpace just had a better website. So they realized it wasn't that it was a bad business model, like clothing fads, and everybody, that's what people thought. It was like, you just switch, everybody will switch en masse every season. They were actually great, but people were staying forever on these sites. These guys just had a bad website. They had a software glitch. So it was a false fail. It was a false fail of Friendster. It was a flaw in the experiment, in the process by which people were making their judgment, not a flaw in the underlying idea, the Loonshot, the crazy idea that social networks had some value. So Thiel wrote Zuckerberg a check for $500,000.
Yeah, I think it was the first outside money into Facebook, non-family and friends into Facebook.
That's right. I think 8 years later, he sold it for $1 billion. And that's how paying attention to a false fail can be very lucrative.
So, let's see here. There's another name I wanted to bring up who I am blanking here. It begins with Sir James Black. James Black. So, who is Sir James Black, and what did he say to you at one point that sticks in memory? Because this may relate in some way.
So he was, and he passed away, a few years ago as well. So he was a Nobel Prize winning pharmacologist, chemist, chemist from Scotland, and he, in some ways, revolutionized drug discovery. He's one of the first what people call now drug hunters. He just had a nose for identifying great new drugs. And so when I met him, I think he was already in his 80s. But we got him interested in what we were doing. There were things that he liked about our little team, our little band of biologists and chemists, and we had a sort of a little, we went against the grain of what people said you should be doing, and that kind of appealed to him. So he would fly over periodically from Scotland and advise our team. And I remember one night, he'd flown over, remember, this is like an 80-year-old guy, and he had flown over, some transatlantic flight, landed in the morning, and he probably had like a 12 or 14, he just went through the whole day of like research, stories, and he'd been talking the whole day and standing on his feet, and we're at, the end of like some dinner, and I am like dropping dead of exhaustion. And I'm probably in my mid-30s or whatever, early 40s at the time. And I'm just like, I just want to go home to bed, right? Because this was a long day. And he's like, and so I'm getting up to like going, he goes, no, Safi, stay. And he like pats me on this, sit down, come have a whiskey with me. I can't do a Scottish accent, but that's what, what I'm saying. And it's like, come have a whiskey with me. And like everybody else leaves. And I'm like, oh my God, how is this 80-year-old guy just like full of it? So he gets some whiskeys, and then he's like, he tells us like why he loves what we're doing and this and that. And then, he starts with, well, let me tell you when I was, and then he like starts with like the Korean War. I'm like, oh my God. Like,
this is going to be a long night.
I'm going to need a shot of adrenaline or something just to stay alive. But I mean, they're fascinating stories of like this guy really developed two phenomenal drug categories that saved millions of lives. So we start talking, he tells me this stuff, and at some point I tell him about how there's this project in the lab that I'm feeling kind of depressed about because I was really excited about, and it's not, it hit this negative result. And he pats me on the knee again, and he goes, oh, my boy, it's not a good drug unless it's been killed 3 times. And I took away from that it kind of gave me pause and made me rethink. And then as I started going through more histories and stories, the revisionist histories that you read about, like great discoveries. Oh, I had this idea on a Monday, and then I showed it to people on Tuesday, and we were all excited on Wednesday, and it worked on Thursday, and the drug was approved on Friday. Like, that is not what happens. These people with these great ideas, they get killed. Like, really, the project gets terminated. Everybody hates it. It's pull the plug. People say, oh, it's tough to kill a project. Let me be a big man and kill a project. It's really easy to kill a project. You just say no. If you're in charge, you just say no funding, you're done. And it never comes back. No one's going to work on a dead project, so no one can prove you wrong. You seem like a big man. It's really easy. It's actually hard to keep a project going. Why? Because any good, crazy idea stumbles and fails. Like Jim said, it gets killed 3 times. It has these terrible failures. It seems like a really bad idea. It doesn't work. It looks like it's not going to work out. And then if you have a really great champion or you get really lucky, you survive that failure. And all of his projects that he won the Nobel Prize for, there are 2 drug categories, the beta blockers and the histamine antagonists, failed like that multiple times. And so that's what he meant. And then when you look back in history, like the statin drugs, I tell a little bit of that story, probably have saved millions of lives, prevented millions of heart attacks. They were killed multiple times, and they almost died and disappeared and never happened. And I've come to think of that as the 3 deaths of the Loonshot. The truly important breakthroughs are killed several times. And it does go against the grain of the stuff that you hear in Silicon Valley all the time of like fail fast and pivot. Fail fast and pivot. Well, okay. But like if you fail fast and pivot, that's probably what everybody else did when they hit the exact same stumble. And sometimes it's the opposite. Like everybody will fail fast and pivot when they hit that same stumble. But if there's something really important underlying there, I mean, often that is the reason why there's something really important is because everybody is turned away from the first stumble. And you need to make it past that first stumble, past the second stumble, past the third stumble, and then you have the gold. And that's why it's gold. Because everybody gives up on the first or second, because everybody's following fail fast and pivot. So everybody's given up. If you've persisted through those failures, that's where the really, really big breakthroughs are.
So let's do a little retrospective on looking at some historical examples, and maybe by way of example, describing what Loonshots are, right? And I believe there are 2 types, and we could talk about Juan and Bob, which is not a country music duo. Give us some examples of Loonshots and maybe the different species of Loonshots.
The 2 types. So there is the one type I think of as a product or a technology that everybody says won't work. So you go way back, the telephone, people said this is a pointless, toy, or the transistor, there's no way you could make a switch out of some solid state device, or personal computer, that's not going to be important, or digital cameras, or even jet engines. That's the Juan and Bob story. Jet engines, there's no way you could ever make a commercial plane with a jet engine. So those are products or technologies that everybody says won't work. Let's call those P-type. The other thing is much less. Those are kind of glamorous because you can put a picture of a product on a
P for product.
P for product. P-type. You can put that on the cover of a magazine, and people get really excited. And there is. We're at South by Southwest, so there is this obsession with product. But what people often miss, and is sometimes much more important, and is a dangerous trap if you miss it, is the other kind. Is a small change in strategy that involves no new technology. It's a small change in strategy, let's call it S-type, that everyone says is crazy or won't work. So what's an example of that? Well, let's take a story of a young kid who wanted to go into retail and wants to open a shop in, where all the customers are, which is big cities. And then his wife happens to say, well, honey, I'm happy to support you in this dream of yours, but I just hate big cities. I'm only willing to live where the town is smaller than 10,000 people. So he says, okay, and he decides he likes being married. He also likes quail hunting. So he knows there's this region in the middle of America where the 4 states come together in a corner, and there are 4 different quail hunting seasons. So he puts his store there, and he moves to a little town called Bentonville, Arkansas, and he opens a store. And he makes it a little bit bigger, and he sells stuff a little bit cheaper, and he gives the store a name. It's called Walmart. Okay, now that ends up absolutely dominating the retail industry and wiping out everybody else. Now, was he thinking about, let me go disrupt the retail industry? No, he had a wife that didn't want to live in a big town, and he liked quail hunting, and he made stuff a little cheaper. So he had small changes in strategy, where he put his store, how big he made his store, and made prices a little bit lower. Were there any new technologies? No. He just sold stuff a little bit. Did he invent retail? No. Did he invent selling stuff a little cheaper? No. These were small shifts in strategy that ended up being incredibly important. So those things are much harder, and they're much less glamorous because they're harder to write about and harder to prove than the P-type things, which are easier to prove. So those are the 2 types.
And just so people aren't left hanging with Juan and Bob, Juan Tripp, Pan Am, and Bob Crandall, American Airlines. But the example that really I had actually not had any familiarity with, which I think I'd love you to describe briefly, is Robert Goddard and the rocket flight in space, right? Because people credit other people, namely, I guess it would have been JFK. But could you describe a little bit of the backdrop for that story?
Sure. So in fact, that gets right to the moonshot. So in 1961, Kennedy announced in a speech to Congress his ambition of putting a man on the moon. And of course, that was widely applauded, and that's actually where the term moonshot comes from. But as we mentioned, those breakthroughs that get us there are rarely recognized and widely applauded at the time. So in fact, how did we actually get to the moon? Well, we got to the moon on a rocket. And how do rockets work? Through a liquid-fueled jet propulsion. So the principles that got us to the moon were invented by a guy named Robert Goddard 4 decades earlier. And he had written it up, he had demonstrated, he'd been working on experiments, he had proved it to pretty good certainty, but he was ridiculed. And I remember I found this in the New York Times, in the archives. This was pretty hilarious. In 1920, I think it was, after Goddard had suggested his idea that we could get to space with these liquid-fueled rockets, in 1920, the Times came out with an editorial and said, oh, this guy, Professor Goddard with his, quote, chair. They literally put quotes around the word chair in physics. Like, that's a bad thing. Air quotes, his, quote, chair in physics at some university like Clark, like making fun that he wasn't an Ivy League guy and he was a, quote, chair. And he says, this guy, this professor doesn't understand the basic laws of physics that we teach our children every day in
quote,
schools.
Seems to lack the knowledge ladled out daily in high schools.
Exactly. Namely, that Newton's laws of action and reaction make rocket flight in space impossible. End of story. So the funny part of that is that, fast forward, I think it was July 11th, 1969, if I remember. It was the day after the successful launch of the Apollo 11 rocket to the moon. The Times issues a retraction, and it says, apparently, rocket flight does not violate the laws of physics, and, quote, the Times regrets the error.
And when you really, really put these seemingly miraculous successes or iconic structures, for instance, the Eiffel Tower, under a fine sort of forensic lens, you realize that, I'm not going to say all of them, but it's certainly a very high percentage, not only encountered resistance, but I mean, exceptionally violent and heavy-handed sort of ad hominem attacks. I mean, the Eiffel Tower, which everyone knows at this point, and it's in every brochure and every sales pitch for Paris and France, was opposed by just about everyone. I mean, it was all uphill. And I want to talk at some point about how smaller teams or entrepreneurs who are maybe solo, maybe with a handful of folks, can think about embracing or structured thinking around Loonshots. But I wanted to jump back to your personal experience for a second. And again, feel free to fact check this, because you can't believe everything you read on the internet or in certainly not in every book. But I have here a quote from Michelle Wie, the golfer's coach, who instructed her, and this is from a book, The Net and the Butterfly. She was given a quote by her coach to repeat to herself whenever she missed a putt. Quote, "I've gotten that out of the way. Now I'm one step closer to becoming the best putter in the history of golf." End quote. And the segue is that you were then mentioned afterwards, and the quote is, "I often think of that quote when I screw up." A, is that true? B, are there? How do you use such a quote or other quotes as a practice or a reminder? It's a lot of question at once.
No, sure, that's good research. So that's from my a very good friend Olivia Fox, who was also at the wedding. You may have met her there, but she sent me an early draft, and I gave her that quote, and it's a mental reminder of, whenever you screw up, and anyone who's gotten anywhere, it's because you've been through those 3 deaths. You've been called a failure, an idiot, including in drafting this book, when you had the same experience.
I did,
every publisher is like, "Oh yeah, there's no way." Books who try to mix physics and business never work. And I'm thinking really, what book that mixed physics? I haven't read any books.
There's so many nevers, just to books on physical fitness, cookbooks don't travel internationally. I mean, there's so many nevers, and you're like, really? Where's the data on that?
Yeah. And so, Olivia was a good friend, asked me for that quote, and I thought about that at the time, and the inspiration a little bit is also tennis. So I played in the juniors as a kid, and grew up playing tennis, and I at the time it was probably, shows how old I am, Pete Sampras versus Andre Agassi was. And so both were, I admired both. Agassi developed this tick or trick, which is at the end of a bad point, if I remember correctly, at the end of a bad point, he would slap his thigh. And that was like a mental little hook to forget about the point. And he just associated with slapping his thigh with forgetting the bad point that he just fucked up and focusing on the current. And that was a little trick for his brain just to stop wallowing in the bad and focus on now. And just the bad just went away. And it's the same thing with Michelle Wie. Yeah, Michelle Wie. And it's, you screw up, you do something stupid. Even in business life, you had a bad board meeting, you said stupid things, or you had a bad investor meeting, or you did something dumb with an employee that you regret doing. You need to slap your thigh, or think of the Michelle Wie example. I screwed that up, and that's one step along the way of me getting better and whatever I'm going to do now. Slap the thigh, and let's focus on, set that behind you, and then move forward. And so that's the kind of golfer quote, or the Andre Agassi slap your thigh trick.
Okay, related, because you use, and not to belabor this, but you use systems and reminders a lot.
Yeah.
Why do you have a Post-it note, and you may no longer have it, but Post-it note that says "The Adventures of Luke Starkiller"?
Oh yeah, it's still up on my wall. I think
what on earth is that? Yeah.
So I did a lot of one of the stories I tell. I tell a bunch of film stories. I have some. One of my really close friends is in film, and we've been friends for many, many years. And so he and I have traded stories. And part of the inspiration was it was so fascinating to me how many of my stories from biotech were so similar to the stories from film, and how what a biotech CEO does is so similar to what a film producer does, and how the markets are structured, the hundreds of biotech companies and the hundreds of film, and the few film majors are so similar to the hundreds of small production shops, and the few film majors at the top, the few pharma majors at the top, and the hundreds of production shops and the hundreds of biotech companies. The film industry structure, the financing of it, the dynamics of it, the focus of it was so similar. Developing a film was so similar to developing a drug. I just found that connection fascinating. So I tell a fair amount of film stories. I realize my answers are kind of long-winded to your. Like I tell a lot of stories to get there. My wife hates that, by the way. See, I'm doing that again. I'm like going off on a tangent story of a tangent. This is a tangent of a tangent of a tangent.
That's why I do long form.
All right. That's why there's a delete button on those videos, I'm sure. Anyways, tell a fair number of film stories. I tell a kind of James Bond story, which was a Loonshot. Like Ian Fleming had written these Bond novels, and he really, he didn't have as much money as as the lifestyle he aspired to, which you can see in these Bond movies. And so he was really trying to sell the film, and everybody had just written this off. Like all the studios, they just weren't buying, and there were a bunch of false fails. They made some TV show which was a disaster, so that was a false fail. And like, and the American studios were like, there's just no way Americans want to see a British dude with an accent, or they're going to believe that, it's like some heroic spy saving the world. Like the stories are junk, and he's kind of a metrosexual. Like, who wants to watch that? He's kind of prissy about his stuff. Like, who wants to see that? And actually, even when he finally got it, he gave up after 8 or 9 years trying to do it, and got these like random producers who, one had just bankrupted his business, and they were trying to sell the movie. They had just sold it to some studio, and they'd cast this guy who was 32 years old, who had been in a movie like Tarzan and the Little People or whatever it was. I forgot what the name was, in like 2 movies, and he'd been a milk truck driver, and the Americans, they made it for $1 million. And the American studio said, you know what, this is absurd. No one's going to want to see. Literally, the quote was, no one's going to watch a limey truck driver, fighting spies. Of course, that guy was Sean Connery. But they really were so sure it wouldn't work. They opened it in drive-in studios. I think it was in Kentucky and Texas. Like, let's just put in a couple drive-in studios and then write it off as a loss. And then the crowd reaction was like, wait, what? And then, of course, it became one of the greatest film franchises of all times. And the 2 top film franchises of all time are James Bond and Star Wars. So I ended up going way back, tracing like minute by minute what happened with Star Wars. And if you search, you can actually find the early drafts. There are 4 early drafts of the script, and you can actually find them. And I've read the drafts. They were freaking horrific. Like, the writing was terrible, the storytelling was terrible, the characters were nothing like the characters that you have at the end, the plot was incomprehensible, it sounded absurd, which is, you could see why studios rejected it at first. And one of the titles of one of the drafts, actually this was the shooting version of the script, the first title was The Adventures of Luke Starkiller. And it was such a stupid name. The hero was called Mace Windy.
Mace Windy, which sounds like, a superhero that farts. Yeah.
And it just it was so bad. Yet it became one of the greatest movies of all time. And so I keep that to help me write FBR, write Fast, Bad, and Wrong. You just realize that all first drafts are shit.
Yeah.
Everything when it starts off is shit. And if Star Wars, one of the greatest movies of all time, was just such horrific shit in the beginning, then you're probably okay. It's all right to have your stuff sound terrible, and that's okay. Just keep going. You fix it up in the editing, which is what they did.
I knew every line to that film as a kid when it came out, and I would drive audiences nuts because it's I think the only film, maybe that and E.T., where I insisted my mom take me to the movies repeatedly. And it was for my family, it was quite an indulgence to go to the movies to begin with, right? But I knew the entire movie by heart. And a split second before any character would say a line, I would say the line in the theater, which understandably drove the people around me batshit crazy. But stuck with me. It had a huge impact. So now I know that Mace Windy is to thank for it. How can smaller teams, and we have so much to chat about. I mean, hopefully we can do a part two, a round two with this, because I would love to. And it's so fun to spend time together. But maybe just with some of the time that we have left, you could talk about how individual entrepreneurs or small teams can think about Loonshots. Like, what is the significance for a single person or a small group?
Right. So, kind of the moral of the story is you want to nurture these Loonshots. So forget about moonshots or big goals, or even the word disruptive innovation is a terrible word. It should be crossed out of every dictionary and taken off of every website, because it's misleading. Because anybody who's been an entrepreneur knows that the ideas that end up becoming incredibly important, that actually in retrospect disrupt the market, nobody knows at the time. Like Sam Walton had no clue. He just liked quail hunting. That's why he went to Bentonville. Had no clue. He wasn't thinking, let me disrupt the retail industry by locating stores in rural America and then building them somewhat. No. He was just like, his wife said he didn't want to live in a big city. And as he pointed out later, we had no idea what the demand would be. So real innovations are less about market projections and some guru waving a PowerPoint about you're going to disrupt this market. That's crap. A real innovation that ends up doing something is like a leaf in a tornado. You just never know where it's going to end up. Anybody tells you it's going to end up there, it's going to disrupt, has not been a real entrepreneur. Most of the great, like the transistor, they were working on building better switches for telecom. And when they came up with Bell Labs, and when they invented the solid-state device, it turned out it wasn't good enough to use in telecom. So they really had no idea what to do with it. It was 5 years before the first application, which ended up being in hearing aids. So were the scientists working on the transistor going to their bosses and saying, let's disrupt the hearing aid market. I have an idea for you. No, they were just trying to build better switches. So the reason you want to nurture Loonshots is to challenge beliefs. It's not you want to use disruptive innovation if you're a history professor and you're writing about what happened in hindsight. Otherwise, don't use it. Walton disrupted the retail industry, transistor disrupted everything, but that's in hindsight. When you're really there at the time, you nurture Loonshots to challenge beliefs, to challenge accepted wisdoms. Some things that you think are absolutely true, maybe you're right, but suppose you're wrong. Do you want to read about it in a press release from your competitor? Or would you rather be nurturing it in your own lab or trying it in yourself and seeing how it plays out? So that's why you nurture Loonshots. So what can small teams or groups do? Well, to succeed with anything, just the idea is a small fraction of it. If you think about a football field, the idea is getting you from your own goal maybe to your own 5-yard line or your own 10 line. Just there's a lot of ideas in the world. You want to be able to take an idea into a real product. You need people who understand the markets, who understand how to segment the market, who understand audiences, who understand how to build, who understand how to manufacture, who understand how to release, how to understand timelines and getting things done on time, on budget, on spec, and that's the other 90 yards. So you need both. And you can think of one as sort of the artist and one as sort of the soldier. You have artists that work on the crazy ideas, and you have the soldiers that get the ball down the other 90 yards. And so you need both. And so that's some kind of one of the things that I get into is why companies often fail is that they don't wear those two. They don't understand the separation that you need for both, they're motivated by two completely different things. And you need to tailor the way you interact, the systems you design, the incentives, the metrics, totally different, almost exactly opposite for artists and soldiers. For artists, you want a high failure rate. if you're not trying stuff and failing stuff. For soldiers, you want a low failure rate. Like let's go to military for aviation. The guys who are coming up with crazy ideas for new technology, if you want them to try lots of stuff and crazy things that nobody said could work and invent, but the guys who are assembling planes, you don't want them to launch 10 planes in the sky and say, well, let's see which 8 fall and crash. No. So it's the exact opposite things you want to reward. So you need to separate your artists and your soldiers and design different tools and manage the balance between the two. So that's if you're a larger company. Now, you asked about what if you're a smaller company or a solo. So you want to separate your artists and soldiers. If you're a larger company, you can separate that by role. If you're a smaller company, you want to think about separating that by time. You want to be very mindful. This sort of comes back to the wearing different hats. You want to be very mindful. We're going to go into a zone where all we're going to do is the artist create, and we want to maximize failure. And then we're going to step out of that zone when we've listed the 100 different ideas and picked the 5, and we're going to minimize failure. We want to get these 5 ideas done on time, on budget, on spec, to customers. So you need to be very self-aware of what zone are you in. And the confusing thing is when you're running a small team, because you don't have different people. You don't have an artist and a soul. Sometimes you do. But you don't want to tell your artists, all right, I need you to have a 98% success rate on your ideas. I need you to have 2 ideas on Monday, 2 ideas on Tuesday, 3 ideas on Wednesday. You can't schedule creative. The converse is when you're dealing with your soldiers, you want to create those metrics. So in a small team or small group, if you can't separate that by role, you want to separate that. We're all going to put off our execution hat, our operational excellence hat, and we're going to put on our crazy artist, wacky, what ideas could kill our business? What are the things that are floating out there that we're sure are not right? The Loonshots. But if they were right, they would kill us. What are those things? What are our embedded assumptions or beliefs about our customers,
right,
our competitors, our substitutes, the nature of our market or regulatory or whatever? We know that these are right. We know that our beliefs are true. But what's the opposite? Suppose they're wrong. What could somebody be doing to kill us? Let's just take a week or whatever it is and think of all the things that we know we're sure is true. What's the opposite? And now let's suspend disbelief, like a movie. Let's suspend disbelief. How might somebody, here's all these reasons to dismiss it and why it could never be true. All the reasons people use to dismiss a Loonshot, that's why it's a Loonshot. Like they made fun of Goddard. Rockets could never fly in space. It's against the laws of physics. All these things that you're sure are true, like the New York Times was sure Newton's laws of physics applied and ruled out, rocketry. All these things you're sure are true. What if they weren't? Or how might a really creative person get away around that? And how might that kill us? Let's just take a week and walk through all the Loonshots that are out there on our customers or our markets or our products or whatever it is, whatever we're doing. How might they kill us? And then if we identify those things, how can we flip that around and use that to knock out our competitors? So that's like separating the artists and soldiers, but not by role, but by time.
Yeah.
And then, now that we've done that, let's take off that hat, and now let's focus on operational excellence, on time, on budget, on spec. Okay, this is not a moment for like innovative, dreamy. This is like deliver on time, on budget, on spec. And there you separate by time rather than by role if you're a small company.
So this is, and we're going to wrap up in just a few minutes, but I want to highlight for people listening how tied together everything is that we've talked about throughout this session 1 of hopefully at least 2, because I love hanging out with you and catching up, in the sense that whether it's fast, bad, and wrong, right, spitting out your 2 shitty pages a day or whatever it might be, In other words, on an individual level, being clear on the hat that you're wearing and segmenting by time, or within an extremely large organization, segmenting by role between artists and soldiers and so on. There are ways to systematize your generation of ideas, vetting of ideas, execution of ideas. And one of the reasons I enjoy, whether it's having drinks, hanging out at your wedding, or simply batting around ideas with you, is that you're very good at asking questions that help with clear thinking, which helps with clearer action or more effective action. Would you be willing, not right now, but some other time, to do a round 2 where we talk about how to bring a gun to a knife fight, which we kind of alluded to, right?
Right.
Incentives, how to apply incentives to other people, to yourself, to teams, et cetera, because this is really, really, really underappreciated, and a whole bunch of other things that I'd love to talk to you about. Would you be willing to do that?
Let's do it.
Okay, awesome. Now, for those people who are only going to perhaps get this episode, I highly, highly recommend, and for those of you who listen to this show a lot, I don't say that lightly, that you grab a copy of Loonshots. It is incredibly pragmatic. It is very well written. I was really impressed because with all the time we've spent together, it's like the identity that I have sort of painted on top of this avatar in my head called Safi is like scientist, entrepreneur, etc. And I get sent a lot of books, and I get sent a lot of books by friends too. And every time I get one, I'm like, oh God, I hope this isn't garbage, because it's just going to be so uncomfortable to try to dance around this somehow. And it's a damn good book. It really is. So I encourage people, loonshots.com, take a look at the book. And if you're like, I still need to be sold, okay, go read up on Safi, and you'll be like, okay, there are probably additional things that I could learn from Safi and from the historical examples that you weave together, right? It's really the way that I like to learn personally, and I think it's the way a lot of humans learn, as you pointed out, is through stories that illustrate points. And it's tempting, I think, and this is another thing that impresses me about you, is to, from the influence of, in some cases, academics, to speak in abstractions and conceptual frameworks without the real life sort of human glue that makes it memorable. And the memorable component is really important, because if you don't have the acronyms, the stickiness of these concepts, how the hell are you going to apply them when the time comes that they're actually important to implement? So check out Loonshots at Safi Bahcall on Twitter, SAFIBAHCALL. We will be continuing the conversation somehow, some way. Is there anything else you would like to say before we wrap up this round 1? Any questions, comments, suggestions to the audience, anything at all that you'd like to say before we wrap up this first portion?
This was just, it was a ton of fun to see you again and just catch up. So, yeah, looking forward to part 2, and looking forward to having drinks together one of these days, and
for sure,
catching up some more.
All right, awesome. There's so much more to explore. So folks, keep an eye out for round 2. I'm gonna twist some arms if necessary, bribe with alcohol if it's called for, and for links to everything that we've discussed in this episode, all the names mentioned, books, etc., authors, and so on, you can go to the show notes. So tim.blog/podcast, and just search Safi, SAFI, or Loonshots, and he will come right up, and you'll have all of it. And until next time, thank you for listening.